I wanted to chat with you today a little bit about analogy and ethics, and think a little bit about some opportunities at the intersection of those two fields. This is work I've done in a collaboration with a former student of mine, Ji-Hyun Kim, who's now a postdoc at Purdue. Somehow managed to get one of those great postdocs with no teaching responsibilities, which is awesome, and is doing really, really lovely things. The big picture here, I think, is I want to start with very comfortable, very familiar ground, and then move into things that maybe are a little less comfortable and a little less familiar in this topic through the course of the conversation. So we are, I think, pretty uniquely qualified to talk about why knowledge transfer is hard, and enormous amounts of work are that those of us on this call and other colleagues as well have indicated, sort of how challenging this can be. That means, I think, that there is probably enormous opportunity to bridge across areas, that we have a lot to learn from one another, because we haven't transferred knowledge over to new areas and brought our insights into their areas and received some of their insights back into ours, because we're pretty thoughtful about what kinds of things might make knowledge transfer easier. Maybe we might be uniquely or particularly able anyway to be helpful in this process. In my wanderings and my conversations in the fields of organization behavior and business more broadly, the aspects of cognitive science that really seem really unknown and dramatically missing is maybe what this group would call relational knowledge. I think there's a lot of appreciation for sort of facts and figures. There's a lot of appreciation for elements of reasoning. There's a fair amount of appreciation for the idea that not all knowledge is easily articulable. I hear a lot about tacit knowledge and the skills that are often implicit in expert performance, but I don't hear a lot about relational knowledge. I think it's just something that's sort of an unknown to a lot of communities outside of ours. And so that's maybe a particular opportunity if you're thinking about bridging your area with another one. And if there's a question that I might have for us collectively, it's to think a little bit about what we know about systems of knowledge. I think we spend a lot of time focusing on particular bits of knowledge, and we've worked a lot on that for a long time. I think we work less on sort of broader systems of knowledge. And I'm going to try to articulate why that might be an interesting question and why we might have unique capabilities in going after it today. So that's a little bit of background. If, one way to think about the data I'm going to show you today is basically, I'm not telling you anything dramatically new. It's stuff you already knew before. And certainly one aspect of the import-export business that we're in here in bringing knowledge that we know into new fields that haven't quite looked at it that way before is that we want to make sure we're replicating some of our core patterns. So many of you and have, all of us have probably read, and many of us have done some of these kinds of studies where we contrast different sorts of learning conditions, maybe where we have a baseline, we just send people out to do something and see how they do, and we compare that with various kinds of training. We give them maybe one example or two examples, we give them an abstract statement of an abstract idea, and we contrast that with something where they participate in some sort of a comparison process, and so forth. Then we find what you normally see in these kinds of studies, which is giving people one or two cases or just individually or reading an abstract statement of a principle on its own isn't terribly effective. It doesn't really lead or produce transfer, but comparing training cases usually does help. In this case, as in other studies, it represents a rough doubling of off baseline of transfer. And then if you enrich that comparison experience in various ways, then you can go even higher. So, the good news is the kind of things that we think about and have shown matter in a variety of contexts also matters in this context of ethical decision making. So I guess the good news is you already have a lot to offer the community of ethics researchers, because you can push around the DV they care about. You can push around ethical decision making with the kinds of tools that you have available and are quite familiar with. So that's good news. So the big topic, if you're an ethics scholar, the probably foundational question is, why do people make unethical decisions? And there are many, many, many answers to that question, but probably the most well-known is that it starts with some appreciation that there is a moral or ethical concern at play in the current context. And so this is Rest's model from 1986, which is that the whole process starts with some sense of moral awareness, that in this situation, there's some kind of moral principle or ethical concern at play, and that should factor into the reasoning process and the decision-making that results. Probably one of the sort of most compelling to me lines of work sort of elaborating on this is from Anne Tenbrunsel, who's at Notre Dame, which, roughly her model looks like this. So if you have moral awareness versus you don't, that leads to two different kinds of decision-making. One of them involves some moral component. The other one does not involve any consideration of morals or ethics. And, either of those processes could lead to a ethical decision or an unethical decision. But, you may be much more likely to make an unethical decision if you have morals or ethics involved in the knowledge and in the reasoning processes of making a judgment. John, that's a great question. So I'm going to walk through how ethical was operationalized in just a few minutes when I get to the particular studies. And the short answer, the preview, if you will, is that we can ask experts in ethics, and we can also ask members of our participant populations. In these studies, we are really not probing the gray areas. We are not, a lot of ethics research and a lot of ethics teaching revolves around, stepping into gray waters, where we're trying to navigate, where the line is between ethical and unethical. I will tell you that's really not where we are in these studies. We're dealing with things that are pretty clearly crossing an ethical boundary, and both the participant populations and the participants themselves and the ethics scholars would all agree that we're across that line into ethical or unethical decision making. So it'll become clear later, but thanks for that great question. It is obviously a challenge, and you're absolutely right. It's not there's a lot of cause for despair here, but I'm going to try and put the best spin on it I can to make us feel that we have room for improvement, and your action is needed to make the world a better place. So there you go. Part of the motivation for my wanting to have this conversation with this audience. I think we have a lot that we can contribute. So if we are, for example, encountering a situation and we put what Anne Tenbrunsel and her many colleagues, and this model is from a paper with Kristen Smith-Crow, but Anne has talked about this in a variety of ways. You might put a business frame on it. So in this context, what that typically means is maybe I do a cost-benefit analysis on the financial information, right? So am I going to earn more profit, earn more in revenues than I am going to have costs, and maybe therefore I should make a decision that maximizes the gains to undertaking a particular endeavor. And if I am trying to maximize, say, financial gains, I may be completely ignoring ethical elements, right? So that's what Anne Tenbrunsel and colleagues really mean by lacking moral awareness and adopting a business frame. They don't mean frame in the sense of maybe a cognitive science definition of frame. They mean something a little bit broader, that there's a collection of knowledge, a set of habits of reasoning that we undertake, and we establish criteria and norms for application that indicate the kinds of answers that are respectable and legitimate and worthy. You could do the same thing with a legal approach, right? We could do a legal analysis of a situation and look at the legal aspects of an outcome. And again, that also may have criteria and frameworks for assessing quality, but that may also rule out and sort of not include ethical considerations. So we can contrast that with adopting sort of what we might call an ethical frame, or sort of bringing a system of knowledge to bear that includes some consideration of ethical and moral concerns. And then the question is, if you're bringing ethics into the knowledge that you're using to understand and represent a situation, maybe that will then inform your decision making, and you will try to make a decision that respects those ethical concerns to some degree. Now, of course, there are many ways to think about what is ethical, right? A la John's question. And there are, of course, concerns of people who are, sort of disregarding ethics, right? Don't care at all. But we are trying to capture what we think from a fair amount of field research are some of the biggest issues that we have in ethical decision-making in contemporary society, which is that many people can make decisions that are unethical without realizing that they are making an unethical decision. That is, they enter into an amoral decision-making process because the knowledge they bring to bear excludes moral and ethical issues. And as a result, they might make unethical decisions because they're making them on the grounds of business criteria, on the grounds of legal criteria, or whatever it might be, rather than incorporating some sense of ethics. It is incredibly easy, just as a simple reminder, it is incredibly easy to rule out kinds of information. These are just a few quick quotes to give you a sense of how dramatically easy it is to make very confident statements that exclude enormous amounts of knowledge and potential insights. So Irving Fisher, a week before the great crash in 1929, stocks have reached what looked to be a permanently high plateau. Tom Watson, chair of IBM, I think the world market, is maybe 5 for the number of computers that we're going to need. And my favorite is the former commissioner of the US Patent Office, which is that everything that can be invented has already been invented, which I just find astounding. So Danny Kahneman, has this sort of what you see is all there is. And I think the general idea that, is trying to be captured there is that it can be very easy to feel as if your current representation, the current system of knowledge you're bringing to bear on a situation is sort of complete, and things beyond that are inconceivable. And so if you're thinking about what is it involved in amoral decision-making, that's really what we're trying to capture, this notion that the knowledge I have feels like complete, feels like it's a complete set of ways of thinking about something, but is sort of shockingly, laughably incomplete. So what does this look like? Here's an example that, of an executive expressing regret that I think is particularly compelling and not at all out of the ordinary. I think this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. So the term of art among company executives was one that former Coke executive Putnam had never heard before: share of stomach. It was a mind-bending paradigm shift for me. We weren't trying to get share of market. We weren't about trying to beat Pepsi or Mountain Dew. We were trying to beat everything that we're trying to be the most drunk liquid, period. So Putnam recalled giving a presentation in which he showed a chart illustrating how consumption of milk had dropped over time and consumption of soda had risen. And he pointed to the place where the two lines crossed, the moment at which soda surpassed milk. And Putnam remembers swelling with pride. I didn't have any reaction beyond "we're winning." It's shocking to me now, but it was not shocking to me then in any way, shape, or form. So that's, I think, what we mean when we talk about this amoral decision-making process, where there's no sort of ethical considerations entering in, and we can be quite confident that we have an accurate decision and a high quality decision, even though it sort of rules out any of these other concerns. Lest we remain comfortable that, it's those business people who are greedy and do these things, but, us scientists are, of course, uniquely thoughtful and considerate. This is a sort of really lovely paper from Clarkburn in 2002. I don't think things have changed dramatically. She did a study of moral awareness. She doesn't use that term in this paper, but that's basically what we're talking about here. which is university science education as such seems to provide no particular stimulus for moral awareness development. That is, we're not training our students to be more aware of ethical issues than when they enter into our programs. And students in her studies recognized relatively few ethical issues that occur in sort of naturalistic science situations, and in most cases recognize them only at the most superficial level. So you know, we have probably in the name of science, you know, we think of ourselves as studying something sort of objective and rational and all the rest of it. We have a tendency, therefore, to push values aside, to treat them as non-scientific, and you know, as well. I'm just doing science, right? I'm just doing, you know, I'm just studying how people think or process. There's no values or ethics there. You know, I hope you're cringing at that statement. I cringe at that statement. I think that's no longer a tenable statement at all. I think a lot of us have realized that we can't push values out of our science and our practice and our research, and we have to think about how we bring ethics and values and a sense of morality into what it is that we are doing. So why are people morally unaware, right? So if the first question of why do people make ethical decisions, maybe, you know, one of the main answers to that question is, well, if you lack moral awareness, you may not be thinking about morals at all. You may therefore be particularly likely to make an unethical decision. So if moral awareness is one of the big levers we have to pull on why people make ethical decisions, then okay, what might enable people, right, to be morally aware? And the existing explanations are largely around motivation and identity, right? Am I the kind of person who thinks about moral and ethical issues and therefore is particularly likely to adopt one of those ethical frames rather than one of those frames that excludes ethics? And the answer that I'm going to pursue in this particular line of studies is one that's going to be super familiar to this audience, which is, well, do people know anything about ethics? So I don't know about you, but if you talk to your colleagues about whether they teach ethics or not, I typically get two answers. And the first answer is, yeah, you can't teach these students ethics. They're adults. By the time they're this age, they know what they think and what they believe, and you can't really change it. And the second thing I hear is, I can't possibly teach ethics. I don't really know anything about it. And so it's really sort of disconcerting to feel on the one hand that people feel that they don't know anything about it, but their students know everything they need to know already and have such well-formed opinions that can't be changed. So I think, you know, I think there's a tension there, and I think people's introspections here are probably more accurate. I think they're probably novices in the domain of ethics. You know, if I give you a problem and it has within it the ability to be well solved and handled with a bit of financial calculation, if you don't solve it in that way, I don't sort of say, are you financially unaware? I might say you're financially a novice and that maybe you need some financial training in order to be more effective at solving finance problems. And so maybe the approach we should take here is that part of the effort in helping us make more ethical decisions and being more aware of ethics is simply to increase your level of expertise in the domain of ethics. So we're going to come at that by basically training people on ethical principles, right? In the same way that we train people on other forms of abstract patterns, other forms of relational knowledge, right? So, you know, are you convergence schema aware? I mean, that's not something I think, I don't know, Keith is here. I don't think you've probably ever heard that idea, right? Are you convergence schema aware? I mean, what a weird thing to ask someone, right? But can you think, is that sort of a schema that you've learned and are familiar with, right? In the same way, you know, more seriously, right, that we might think about, you know, are there sort of principles of, you know, complexity science or physics or math or whatever that we've been studying for years, right? Are you understanding those in some way? So very simple line of studies, very simple logic. We engage in a learning intervention familiar to this group. We see if people develop, as a result of that learning intervention, knowledge of an ethical principle. We see if that leads to greater moral awareness, and that in turn connects to ethical decision making. The general approach in these studies is we provide training cases where people make an unethical choice, but there's no commentary or mention of ethics whatsoever. So for example, I'm a mayor of a town. There are three proposals that I have to choose between for who's going to do some new project for the town. One of them is pitched by their chief sales officer, who is the son of the mayor. The mayor chooses the proposal from the company whose son made the pitch. And that's the end of the story, right? So that's it. We just state the facts. If you are new to this area of ethical study, that is called a conflict of interest, right? When you have, you're supposed to be making a decision on the basis of what's best for your town, but instead you have this secondary goal that affects you individually, in this case, maybe supporting your child, and that could generates a conflict of interest between what is best for the town and what is best for you and your son and your family. So that's the kind of example we give people. These scenarios are relatively unstructured, so we're not giving people sort of large tables of financial data or large discussions of law. We're pretty naturalistic with these so that people can impose their own judgments on what criteria and concerns matter. And then we put them in a test case. There's a situation where there is, in this case, a conflict of interest. We look at other principles too. We don't mention ethics at all, and we ask them for an open-ended question and accept open-ended responses, which then we content analyze. So we never prompt them, are there moral or ethical issues in this scenario, until after they have given us their response to our test cases. I'll come back to why this is so important later on. So really simple study one. We are training people on the conflict of interest principle. We give them two cases, one after another, and we just, one group gets the cases one at a time, separate cases. They read a case, they say, hey, tell us what's important about this, tell us what you think is going on. And then they do that for a second case. A comparison group, we simply ask them to talk about the similarities in the two cases. And we have a third group where there's no training intervention whatsoever. In the comparison and separate cases groups, we code what they write for knowledge of, in this case, of an articulation of the conflict of interest principle. We have a whole schematic for what that principle consists of, and we see if they capture that principle. The comparison group, unsurprisingly, better articulates the principle than the separate cases group. That replicates many, many studies, so I'm not showing you anything new here in that regard. We then put them in a decision scenario, and we see if they spontaneously say that there's a conflict of interest or there's some sort of moral ethical concern about the conflict of interest, and the answer is they're more likely to do that in the comparison group than the separate cases group. And then do they make a decision that is ethical? And in this case, an ethical decision counts as one that avoids making the conflict of interest choice, or if they do make the conflicted choice, they are disclosing, right, that there is a conflict of interest and that they are acknowledging that conflict, but for additional reasons feel that it is an appropriate choice. There's a discussion in the behavioral ethics literature about whether disclosure is satisfactory and is an ethical approach, but it is widely discussed in the ethics community, and at least you can make an argument that there's an ethical basis for disclosure, and so there's some signal of ethical behavior there. And if we ask our participant populations, we find that they feel that if you disclose, then you are acting in a reasonable fashion. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The seromediation is quite clean. And so, this is exactly the kind of study you've seen before. It's just in the context of ethical decision-making with a bit of ethical knowledge. We've made people a little bit more expert in the domain of ethics, and it has just the kinds of effects you would expect. This is basically a pure replication, except in this case, we're not using the conflict of interest principle, but rather we're talking about safety or harm. So are my decisions going to generate the likelihood of physical or emotional harm in others? And we see the same kinds of effects here that we saw with the conflict of interest. So just a pure conceptual replication with new materials, different ethical principle, and you see the same pattern. There is one piece, though, that we did, which is after this study ended, we did a variety of other analyses. So let me focus on that. So the first is, after they were done making their decision, we then explained to them, hey, in this test case, there was this safety issue. One of these decisions led to an increased risk of harm. In this case, physical harm to people in the context. And, you have now an opportunity to change your decision, keep your decision the same, invent a new outcome. What would you like to do? And in this case, what we see is that everybody across conditions, in the comparison training, the separate cases training, or no training whatsoever, we now see that they're all making what is considered the ethical decision here at roughly 70–75%. And there are no differences across condition. So the ethical decision-making that we just saw that has a difference by condition, we can make an argument as being driven by a lack of understanding of this principle, leading to a lack of spontaneous recognition of the issue, and therefore a lack of ethical decision-making. Once you point that all out, people change their decision. Now, maybe there's some task demand here. That's plausible, but it's interesting to note that these numbers aren't 100%. There are people who see, yes, there is an ethical issue here. There is a safety concern in this particular case, but I still think that's the right decision, and maybe the safety issue is manageable. That's, okay, fine. I appreciate why someone might make that decision, but still, if we're at about 75% making that ethical decision, we do see that there's quite a big jump from what they did. So in effect, what we're trying to articulate here is that what is the decision you make if you had sort of full and complete information, as opposed to learning this later and then sort of feeling enormous regret for the choice that you made? What if people did have that representation and that understanding? What would they do at that point? Okay. The second piece I want to point out here, and this is the table in the sort of lower part of the slide. We ask people the standard scales for moral identity and moral attentiveness. So these are scales that are widely used in ethical behavioral ethics research. So moral identity is the kind of thing like, I view myself as a moral person. I feel like I'm a member of a moral community. When I walk around in the world, I think of myself as the kind of person who's cares and concerned about ethics. And moral attentiveness is, in particular, I am the kind of person who always thinks about, recognizes, talks about moral and ethical issues. There are two aspects to the pattern here that I find really, really striking. The first one is that there is no correlation between those scales and knowledge of the safety principle, spontaneous moral awareness of a safety concern in the scenario, or ethical decision-making in the scenario. So walking around feeling this way about yourself doesn't seem to have translated into spontaneous recognition of a choice to potentially, in this case, cause harm. And if we have a second measure of moral awareness, which is a pretty standard measure of moral awareness, which isn't the spontaneous moral awareness that we are coding, but rather it's a prompted moral awareness scale, which says, did you think about the moral issues in the example that you just assessed? So in that case, the moral awareness scale is prompting them about ethics and asking them whether they, to what extent did they consider there to be ethical and moral issues in the case at hand. In that case, moral identity and moral attentiveness are related. So the kind of people who, when you ask them about ethics, tell you, yeah, there's something going on, are the kind of people who tell you they have a moral identity and are morally attentive. But that's really distinct from whether they spontaneously recognize moral issues in a given situation. Alexander, exactly right. I am completely with you. So the last thing on this slide, there are no effects of age, gender, work experience, learning, intervention time. Okay, so why did I highlight that? No effects of learning, intervention time. So it doesn't matter how long you spend in the comparison training or in the separate cases training. That doesn't seem to be connected to outcomes. So that's, and there were no differences across conditions. So in some sense, that's just sort of telling us that it's not something simple about the instructions and et cetera. I know they're often, like, no effects of these demographics in our studies, and we don't pay a lot of attention to them. But I just want to highlight it in this particular group. Conflict of interest, physical safety, those are the kinds of things that you think might matter in the world. And these are participants who are in online pools, who are average age about 35, with a standard deviation about 10 years. So we're talking about middle-aged people working. And those are the kinds of people where being 25 versus 45 versus, whatever seems to have no real difference in whether you recognize safety issues and whether you are spontaneously noticing those things and making ethical decisions. So if somehow life experience was going to teach you this stuff, we should be seeing age or work experience kinds of correlations, and we don't see them in any of these studies whatsoever. So there really seems to be an education opportunity here to intervene and teach. The third study that I wanted to share with you today uses, the first two studies are sort of scenario-based. This one, we have an actual behavioral task. So we put people in effectively a financial advisory position where, and it's a fairly elaborate scenario. So I'm going to explain it just a little bit so you can see we really took a lot of care and effort to try and make this seem reasonably realistic. And we put some financial stakes here. So there are two parties here in this scenario. So one of them plays the role of an investment advisor, and the other one plays the role of a client investor. So our client investors are given two investment options, and if they pick the right one, they win $1. So they have a reason to try and pick the right one. They don't get tremendous amounts of information about the investment options, and we give them an opportunity to pay a quarter in order to go get information from an investment advisor who has more detail on the investment options. And 73% of the client investors pony up the 25 cents in order to get greater insight into the investment options. Okay, so that's a reasonable kind of mapping onto what happens in your financial life. You have some financial choices, you have limited knowledge, you maybe pay someone a modest amount because there might be a larger payoff if you do this well and you'd like to be informed. Our target in these studies are the investment advisors. They have two investment options. They have a fair amount of detailed information about both options. And critically, one of them, they get a bonus commission. So if your client investor chooses this investment option, you get a commission of $1. Okay. So there is potentially a conflict of interest for the investment advisor, right? If they if they recommend investment option B and the client investor chooses investment option B, then the investment advisor gets the bonus commission. Okay. Just so you know, I'm calling them investment options A and B. We counterbalance everything, so there's no difference, and there was no difference between the investment options or which one had the commission or any of that in anything. So I'll just call them A and B so we can bear in mind that investment option B was the one with that bonus commission that creates the conflict of interest. What do we find? We find, well, there are four basic kinds of advice our investment advisor could give. They could recommend investment option A or B, and they could reveal that they have an option to receive a bonus commission or not reveal that information, right? So those are the four ideal types. After the client investors were given their information, we said, hey, there are four kinds of feedback you could have gotten. Here are they. You could get investment option B with no mention of the commission. You could get investment option B, but revealing that there's a commission. You can get A and no talk of commission, or you could get a recommendation for A and you reveal that there's a commission for B. All four types. Okay, what do we find? If you recommend investment option B and you do not mention the commission, the client investors tell you that is unethical, that's really not right. And all the other three possibilities they consider to be plausibly ethical. The most ethical is sort of investment option A and revealing that there's a commission for B, but all of those are considered plausible. Recommending B and explaining that there is a commission, or recommending A with no discussion, or recommending A with revelation. Okay, so in this case, we have this unethical choice of recommending investment option B, but not mentioning that there's a bonus commission, and that's really what we're going to study. in this particular case, actual financial stakes on both sides. Will the investment advisor recommend investment option B and not mention the bonus commission? That would be an unethical decision. All the others are ethical decisions. What do we find? The same thing we found in the first two studies that I showed you, which is the comparison group is more likely to exhibit knowledge of the ethical principle of conflict of interest, more likely to show moral awareness, although that difference is marginal in this case. And greater likelihood of ethical decision-making, that is not making the recommendation of B without revealing the commission. To John's earlier point, these numbers are still quite low, which tells you that a great many of these participants are perfectly happy to recommend the unethical option, which is recommending the biased investment decision and not revealing the commission. So that's somewhat troubling, even though knowledge is having some benefit here. And you will notice that the effects of knowledge are lower in this condition, in this study than they were before. And we attribute that to the fact that we have a direct competing financial interest. So that tells us something about the robustness of understanding we might need to generate in order to lead to actual behavioral differences, and that awareness is not the entire story, which is appropriate. A few other points, just as in the study 2, we asked people afterwards, hey, there's a conflict of interest here. Did you notice that? Is that a concern for you? What would you do now? We do see a jump. So people are sort of lured by the prospect of a bonus. And if you point out there's a conflict of interest, and that's they do adjust what they say they should do a bit afterwards. So, to some extent, greater understanding may make it easier for people to make choices that are in line with their own values and ethics. And so we still have quite a bit of room in terms of our training. Just as before, moral identity and moral attentiveness had no effect whatsoever, right? There's no correspondence between those things and knowledge of conflict of interest, not spontaneous moral awareness or ethical decision-making. Again, no effects of age or work experience on any of these outcomes whatsoever. And to the extent to which moral identity and attentiveness predict anything, they predict your responses to when you are directly prompted about morals and ethics. Will you say there's something morally relevant there? But that's about it. It doesn't really affect anything else. Okay. Two other quick studies just to give you a broader sense of what we've been playing with here. So can we make the intervention stronger? This is a very subtle instruction to compare. That's it. We don't talk about ethics. We don't talk about morality. We don't provide them with a label, nothing. So in this particular study, we contrast conflict of interest across 3 conditions. In one case, we simply say, hey, there's this thing called a conflict of interest. Do you know what that is? Tell us what it is. So we ask them what the principle is, right? It's the kind of thing you might have heard about. Tell us what it is. The other group, we give them the conflict of interest principle. We use a pretty straightforward textbook definition. And then we ask them to basically re-say it in their own words. And then we have a comparison group like before, except this time we give them the principle and we walk them through correspondences, and we take a great deal of effort to have them sort of appreciate the abstraction through the examples and the comparison, as well as with an abstract statement. We see, of course, that if you give them the principle or ask them the principle, they do moderately well at revealing their knowledge, but not as well as if you really walk them through it. So that's consistent with the idea that most people that were participating in our studies are novices when it comes to conflicts of interest. They don't really understand what that is very well, even when you literally give them the textbook definition. And then spontaneously, whether it's a filled delay or an unfilled delay, and they literally go from the training right to a decision scenario, we see very low spontaneous awareness of the conflict of interest and very low ethical decision-making when you're just giving people an abstract statement or asking them. So that suggests that you need to work quite a bit harder in order to generate this, and that everyone knows this is probably a pretty poor way to think about conflicts of interest and perhaps other ethical concerns more generally. The last study I want to share with you, again, pushing on labels and being explicit about things. We have a comparison plus principle group that sort of articulated dramatic training intervention. We compared that against a simple instruction to compare, as well as just two cases separately. And in this case, we literally labeled the test scenario. This is a business decision. This is an ethical decision. This is a conflict of interest decision. Okay, so we literally labeled the decision task a conflict of interest decision, and we got about 40% of our participants making an ethical decision when we literally labeled it a conflict of interest decision in the separate cases group. Comparison and compare with principle are a bit higher. If we call it ethical, the trends are sort of in that direction, but there's no reliable difference between the compare group and the separate cases group. And in the business decision group, comparison and separate cases don't separate at all, which is a little surprising. They do in other groups, but maybe that business frame is so strong that it really torches whatever they might have gotten out of their comparison. It is interesting to note, though, that if you do the strong intervention, comparison plus principle, they're at pretty high levels, regardless of the frame that you put on it. So if you make them very strongly aware of these ideas, then maybe they can overcome some situational biases in the task framing itself. Okay. All right. So at this point, what I want to do is just sort of pull back and talk about sort of two items. The first is that, from these studies, and there are a few more that I didn't talk about, novice understandings of ethical principles seem to contribute to a lack of moral awareness. And that if we therefore do the kind of learning interventions this community is really familiar of, we might be able to make a difference and make people develop better understandings, lead to more greater levels of moral awareness and perhaps more ethical decision-making. The potential question that I have for you is the implication of this that most of us are ethics novices? And you can probably guess by now, my answer is probably yes. How many ethics classes have you taken? And how much have you studied ethics in your career, whether that's in schooling that you've had or individually? I think you'd probably argue from that experience that most people probably don't have deep training in ethics. And maybe that's something that you can actually train, that it's not just about how you identify and how motivated you are, but there's actually substantive knowledge that we could be working on developing. And we have the tools to teach that kind of knowledge. The second question I have for you to think about is there sort of principle-specific moral awareness? So we trained conflict of interest. We trained, physical safety and harm. We trained very specific relational bits of relational knowledge with very particular situational role systems. That's how we normally do this when we train people using the kinds of approaches that we train, right? We train on a particular knowledge system for a particular mapping, for a particular bit of analogical transfer. So that raises this really interesting question when you're thinking about ethics broadly construed, which is, okay, we could have principle-specific moral awareness and maybe principle-specific training interventions. Is there such a thing as sort of general moral awareness? Is there moral awareness at the level of ethics rather than at the level of, say, conflicts of interest or something like that? And I think that leads to a still broader question, right, for us, which is, what does knowledge transfer look like at a general sort of knowledge system level, right? So it's a different way of characterizing perhaps what it means to be an expert in an area. And is there something sort of beyond the level of these individual principles? I think we have reasons to think there might be, but I'm not sure exactly we know how to articulate and talk about that in quite the level of precision that we're used to having those discussions. The last thing, and I didn't even put it on the slide, but I just wanted to highlight that this work implies that there is an ethical component to the knowledge that we're using in our judgment and decision-making processes. And we probably spend a lot of our time thinking about schemas or principles or relational structures without thinking about the moral and ethical components that are involved in them. And so do we have to think about cross-cutting knowledge, or do we need to start thinking about sort of what are the ethics embedded in the kinds of knowledge structures that we're used to analyzing and studying? And what would that mean for us if we have to think more consistently for all the knowledge systems that we are playing with about their moral and ethical components. I guess another way to put this, and most of you are not in business school, so I can say this kind of thing, if there is such a thing as a business frame, and if we're allowing training students to make decisions based on cost benefits of the financial returns, and we're not including ethics in that frame, we are setting up people to go out in the world and make decisions that ignore ethics. And so when we're doing our training, when we're thinking about that, are we training knowledge? Are we developing people with understandings where those systems of knowledge ignore ethical concerns? And are we training people to go out and use knowledge without any consideration for the ethical implications of that? John asked a great question. I am just gonna, at this point, thank you and stop sharing my screen. And then I'll start, John, with your question, and then we'll hopefully have a bit of a conversation from here. So thanks for giving me a chance to share this. And I hope I've given you a few new things to think about, even if it's just about how foolish I am. Thank you.